what I want to do is come down and talk about the drug market for SLE. It's a limited market because SLE is not that big a disease. It's fairly rare, despite the fact that there are more SLE patients out there than might classify it as a rare disease per se. We have the antimalarials, right? Belimumab, cytotoxic immunosuppressive agents, glucocorticoids, which we've all dumped on severely here, prednisone, and the NSAIDs. So why don't we contrast these? Just set us up.
Well, what will happen in the future is we will have to accept the fact that lupus isn't one disease in its pathogenesis. So the biologics that are coming down the pike for lupus will be in different classes. This is very similar to what's happened in rheumatoid arthritis, for example. So right now it's very popular to go after B cells because obviously they make autoantibodies. And that was the rationale for Benlysta because it targets a survival factor for B cells. And then there are other biologics in a very similar family that attack this B cell survival factor that have gotten as far as phase 2s. But there are other B cell targets. There's a biologic called erythematosus that goes after CD22 on B cells.
And by the way, I'm glad you had to pronounce it, but keep going.
But that's just the beginning because T cells are also involved in lupus. And there are drugs like abatacept, already approved for rheumatoid arthritis that may have future roles in lupus. There are multiple cytokines involved in lupus, such as interleukin-6 and interferon alpha. We have so many opportunities in lupus, there are almost not enough patients in academic centers to actually enroll in all the potential trials that are out there. But that doesn't mean we won't forget the basics. Hydroxychloroquine for all. Basics are really important in lupus.
Okay. Is there an economic benefit or a managed care advantage to the newer drugs? Or am I hearing from you, just put them on the antimalarials?
I think if we had the opportunity to understand through better biomarkers, right? Easy to diagnose, easy to understand how not everybody, the course of disease is not uniform. So who is going to have end organ failure and at what rate? Who's going to have the most severe disease? What do we do for African American populations or Hispanics? So the ability scientifically to personalize the drug therapy that hopefully could impact outcomes, I think that's sort of the world that we want to live in, to be able to minimize risk of perhaps corticosteroids. But again, how do you scientifically individualize that effort?
Well, we're not there yet. We probably aren't there for most of the rare diseases. We don't have the ability right now scientifically to subset patients at onset or even at the onset of a clinical trial to know if this is the right biologic for that patient.
But have you guys parsed out the per use and lifetime costs by the various modalities? I'm sure you've got data tables on this. You've got spreadsheets on this, right?
But we know the costs. We know that the cost of a lupus patient going into renal failure is going to be $100,000 per year of renal failure. We know the cost of managing lupus nephritis is probably somewhere between $30,000 and $60,000 per year per patient. But even general, garden variety lupus is going to be about $15,000 per year.
But can you prove, and I'll ask your question, or you want to ask it, be my guest, can you prove that these drugs will reduce those costs?
Well, no, we can't, unless we're going to be sophisticated enough to look at the long-term outcomes, cardiovascular disease, infection, hospitalizations, even build in the cataracts into that. That's the only way I think we're going to make decisions based on economics. But remember, I don't want to make decisions based on economics.
Some of the pharmaceutical companies are developing budget impact tools that we could plug numbers into that looks at not just the cost of the medication, but the cost of either side effects or the cost of not treating patients. So we can plot that into, they're not perfect, but we have a good idea of what those costs are. But as you mentioned also too, what we ask from pharmaceutical companies all the time is, can you say with a level of maybe not 100% guarantee, but very close to it, that if we deploy the use of these drugs, there is going to be very direct correlation between use of this drug and reduction in use of other healthcare services. because we don't want to raise the cost on one side and not necessarily decrease the cost on the other side. Also, too, the optimal value for us is if we're going to raise costs on one side, that we see definitely commensurate or greater reduction on the other side, and for the patient also for the quality of life, because we know that every time a patient ends up in the hospital, that there is always a probability of even coming out worse. So if we can prevent every hospitalization that we can prevent with the use of a drug, however, we need to see that data also too, the correlation.